It was a hot summer evening in Washington, D.C., when the calm of the city was shattered by the discovery of a chilling murder. The victim, 32-year-old Lila Brooks, was found in her apartment, lifeless and slumped over her desk, the final note of a life snuffed out too soon. The police were immediately called to the scene, but the investigation would take a twist no one could have predicted. Lila had been working as the personal secretary to Thomas Adams, a prominent Secret Service agent who was known for his dedication to his job and his impeccable reputation. To the outside world, Adams was the picture of professionalism, an unshakable pillar of authority within the nation's most elite security agency. But behind closed doors, Adams had a secret that would lead to a tragedy neither he nor anyone else could have foreseen. Thomas Adams was 40 years old, a man who had built his career on a foundation of loyalty, discipline, and hard work. His colleagues saw him as an upstanding individual, a model of integrity in a world where such qualities were hard to come by. He was married to his high school sweetheart, Margaret, a quiet woman who preferred to stay out of the limelight. Together, they had 2 children, a boy and a girl. Their family seemed the epitome of normalcy. But Lila Brooks, who had started working for Adams just 3 years ago, knew a different side of him. The two had become close. At first, it was professional, as Lila managed the constant demands of her boss's schedule. But as time passed, their relationship grew more personal. Adams was a man of few words, but there was something about Lila that brought out a side of him that no one else saw. Perhaps it was her sharp mind, or the way she listened attentively to his every word, as though he were the most important person in the world. Whatever it was, they became close. Too close for comfort. What began as a professional relationship soon became something more. A chance encounter at a late-night meeting in Lila's office sparked a passionate affair. It was meant to be a temporary escape for both of them, a fleeting connection to ease the tension of their respective lives. But as the months passed, that affair grew deeper, more intense, and more dangerous. Thomas knew that getting involved with someone at work was risky, especially someone like Lila, who was privy to his deepest secrets. But Lila had a way of making him forget the consequences, of making him feel alive in a way he hadn't felt in years. Their late-night meetings became a regular affair, with Lila often staying late to work on sensitive files and Adams sneaking into her apartment after hours. By day, they carried on with their professional personas, but by night, their affair was all-consuming. As the months turned into a year, the weight of their secret grew heavier, but neither could bring themselves to end it. It had become more than just physical. It was emotional, psychological. They needed each other in ways neither had expected. But as with all secrets, theirs could only remain hidden for so long. Lila had always been meticulous. She never once gave an inkling of their relationship to anyone at work. But one evening, while Thomas was out of town on an assignment, Lila made a decision that would change everything. She had always dreamed of more than sneaking around in the shadows. She wanted him to leave his wife. She wanted to be the one that Thomas chose, to make their affair public, to have him for herself without the guilt and the secrecy. Lila wasn't naive, though. She knew the stakes. If their affair were discovered, it would ruin Thomas's career, destroy his family, and likely lead to criminal charges. But she was tired of living in the shadows. She was tired of being the other woman. So, she confronted him. It was an ordinary Tuesday when Thomas returned to find a letter on his desk at work. Lila's handwriting, precise and firm, made it clear that she was tired of playing second fiddle. She wanted a future with him, an honest, open future. But Thomas knew that such a thing was impossible. He had too much to lose, too much riding on his career, his family. The consequences were too high. He couldn't let her destroy everything. As the days passed, their communication became strained. Lila's letters became more frequent, more desperate, demanding that Thomas make a choice. Their late-night meetings were less frequent, and when they did meet, the mood was tense, the air thick with unspoken words. Lila had begun to push harder, but Thomas, ever the pragmatic agent, was beginning to pull away. He wasn't sure how to handle the situation, but one thing was clear: he could not afford to lose control. On the evening of the murder, Thomas knew that Lila was reaching a breaking point. He had been avoiding her calls, dodging her attempts to meet. But that night, she demanded an answer. He had no choice but to go to her. Little did he know, this was a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was a quiet night when Thomas Adams arrived at Lila's apartment, the weight of the decision pressing on his chest. He hadn't wanted to come. He hadn't wanted to face her, to confront the truth of what their affair had become. But Lila's letters, her increasingly desperate messages, had left him with no other choice. He knew that things couldn't go on this way. Their secret had reached its breaking point. Lila's apartment was a small, elegant space on the second floor of a brownstone building in Georgetown. She had decorated it with a mix of modern and vintage furnishings, with large windows that overlooked the city's skyline. As Thomas entered, the lights were dimmed, and the faint sound of jazz music drifted from the stereo. It was an atmosphere of calm, a stark contrast to the turmoil that simmered beneath the surface. Lila was sitting at her desk, her back to the door, scribbling something in a notebook. She didn't turn when he entered, didn't even acknowledge his presence. She had known he was coming, of course. The tension had been building between them for weeks, and she was ready to finally have the conversation that would change everything. Thomas closed the door quietly behind him, then paused, unsure of what to say. Lila's silence was deafening, and he felt the weight of her expectations bearing down on him. He had been avoiding her for so long, putting off the inevitable. But tonight, there was no more running. Tonight, he would have to face the truth. "I'm here," he said, his voice low and hesitant. Lila didn't respond immediately. Instead, she slowly turned in her chair to face him. Her eyes were red, her makeup smudged from hours of crying, but there was something resolute in her gaze, something that made Thomas feel a chill in the pit of his stomach. She had been holding on to something for so long, and tonight, she was ready to let it all out. "I've been waiting for you," she said quietly, her voice trembling but firm. "I can't keep doing this, Thomas. I can't keep pretending that this is okay. I can't keep being your secret." Thomas took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to apologize, to take her in his arms and tell her everything would be fine, but the words caught in his throat. The truth was that he had already made his decision. He couldn't leave his family. He couldn't risk his career. And he certainly couldn't let her destroy everything he had worked so hard to build. "I'm sorry, Lila," he said, his voice tight, "but I can't do this anymore. You knew what this was from the beginning. We can't be together." The words stung, and for a moment, Lila looked as though she might collapse. But instead, she stood up from her desk, her chair scraping across the floor. She looked at him with a mixture of anger and sadness, her eyes blazing with frustration. "Don't you dare tell me what I knew," she spat, her voice rising. "I've been here, waiting for you. I've been patient. I've been understanding. But you never even considered what I wanted, did you? You just used me, Thomas, and now you're just going to walk away." Thomas's heart sank as he realized how far gone their relationship had become. This wasn't just a lover's spat. This was the culmination of months of resentment and anger, the breaking point of a fragile and toxic connection. "I didn't use you," he said, his voice softer now, though still firm. "I cared about you, but I can't leave my family. I can't throw my life away for something that was always going to end in disaster." Lila shook her head, tears beginning to well up in her eyes once more. "You don't get it, do you? You never cared about me, not the way I cared about you. You wanted me because I was convenient, because I was easy. But now I'm not easy anymore, am I? Now I'm a problem you have to get rid of." Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. He had never seen her like this, so broken, so desperate. In a twisted way, he understood her pain. But the reality was, he had already made his choice. He was not going to give up his life for her. He couldn't. "I'm sorry," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "But this is over." The silence that followed was suffocating. Lila's body trembled with emotion, and Thomas could see that she was on the edge, teetering between despair and rage. She stood there for a moment, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Then, without warning, she lunged toward him, her voice a shrill scream as she shouted, "You can't just leave me. You can't do this to me." Thomas recoiled, taking a step back, his heart racing. He had never seen her this angry before, and the intensity of her outburst caught him off guard. For a moment, he wondered if he had made a mistake, if there was a way to make things right. But as Lila's face twisted in fury, all he could think about was getting out of there before things escalated further. "I have to go," he said quickly, turning toward the door, but Lila wasn't done. She ran after him, grabbing his arm and pulling him back toward her. "You're not going anywhere, Thomas," she hissed, her grip tightening. "You don't get to just walk away from me. Not after everything." The desperation in her voice sent a shiver down Thomas's spine. He struggled to break free from her grasp, but Lila was stronger than he expected. In a flash of panic, he shoved her away, trying to create some distance between them. But Lila wasn't backing down. She stumbled back, her eyes wild with rage, and then she turned toward her desk. Thomas's eyes widened as he saw her hand reach for something on the surface, something heavy. Before he could react, Lila picked up a blunt object, a paperweight, and swung it toward him with all her strength. The impact was brutal. The blow hit Thomas squarely in the temple, and his body crumpled to the ground in a heap. Dazed, blood trickling from his head, Thomas tried to push himself up, but his vision blurred. Lila stood over him, breathing heavily, her eyes filled with a mixture of fury and madness. "You won't leave me," she murmured through gritted teeth. "You won't ever leave me again." With one final, desperate motion, she picked up the heavy object again and brought it down on Thomas's skull. The room went black. The following morning, the sun rose over Georgetown, casting a pale light into Lila's apartment. The peaceful stillness of the early hours contrasted sharply with the horror that had unfolded the night before. The once lovely space was now a scene of chaos. Blood stained the carpet, a grim testament to the violent act that had taken place. Lila stood near the window, her face expressionless as she gazed out at the city below. The weight of what she had done settled heavily on her shoulders. Thomas Adams, the man she had loved, the man who had promised her the world, was dead, and in her mind, it was his fault. He had left her with no choice. He had pushed her to the edge, and now he was gone 4 hours. She had wandered through her apartment in a daze, trying to come to terms with the events of the night. But there was no coming back from this. No easy way out. She had killed him. At first, the plan had been simple. Confront him, make him understand the depths of her feelings, force him to see how much he had hurt her. But when he had tried to leave, when he had rejected her for the final time, that was when the rage had consumed her. She hadn't meant to kill him, not at first, but in the heat of the moment, with the pain of his betrayal and rejection cutting through her like a knife, she had done it. Now, standing over Thomas's lifeless body, Lila knew she couldn't undo it. She couldn't bring him back. But she also knew that she couldn't let this moment define her. She had to get rid of the evidence, cover her tracks. She had to make sure no one found out what she had done. Later that morning, the police arrived at the scene. Detective Sarah Reynolds was the first to enter Lila's apartment. She had been working on the case of Thomas Adams's disappearance for several days, after he had been reported missing by his colleagues at the Secret Service. At first, the case seemed like just another missing persons report, but as the days dragged on and no trace of Thomas was found, the investigation began to take a darker turn. Lila's name had come up several times during their inquiries. She had been close to Thomas, too close for comfort, and when they traced his last known movements, they found that he had been in constant communication with her up until the night of his disappearance. The police had questioned her earlier, but she had maintained her innocence, claiming that she hadn't seen Thomas since their last meeting. It was a classic case of a woman trying to distance herself from a murder, Detective Reynolds had thought. But something about Lila's demeanor had raised suspicions. Now, entering the apartment, Detective Reynolds knew that she was walking into a different situation entirely. She could feel the tension in the air, the heaviness that seemed to linger as she crossed the threshold. The door creaked open, and Lila turned to face the detective. Her eyes were cold, calculating, a far cry from the emotional wreck she had been the night before. It was as though a switch had been flipped. Lila knew what had happened, knew the gravity of her actions, but now she was no longer the victim of a broken love affair. She was something else entirely. Detective Reynolds's gaze moved past Lila to the scene in the living room. There, on the floor, was Thomas Adams, his body splayed out in a grotesque manner. Blood had pooled around him, staining the carpet. The weapon, Lila's paperweight, was lying just a few feet away, the smooth glass glistening ominously in the soft morning light. Lila stood motionless, her expression unreadable as the detective took in the scene. "Ms. Martinez," Detective Reynolds began, her voice calm but firm, "we need to talk." A few hours later, Lila was in the interrogation room. The police had quickly moved to arrest her, charging her with murder. They had found her fingerprints all over the paperweight, and the bloody trail leading from Thomas's body to the desk, where she had last been sitting, didn't help her case. But it wasn't just the physical evidence that sealed her fate. It was her demeanor, her cold, calculated nature as she answered their questions. Lila didn't seem particularly remorseful, nor did she seem scared. In fact, she seemed almost detached, as if the entire incident had happened to someone else. When asked about the events leading up to Thomas's death, she provided a detailed account, though her version of the events didn't quite match the evidence. She claimed that Thomas had been the one to become violent first, that he had attacked her, and that in self-defense she had struck him with a paperweight. But the autopsy report contradicted her story. There were no signs of struggle on Thomas's body, and the angle of the blow suggested that Lila had been the one to act first. As Detective Reynolds listened to Lila's account, she couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Lila's words were too rehearsed, too perfect. She had spent hours thinking about this moment, crafting the exact story that would get her off the hook. But Detective Reynolds wasn't fooled. She had seen this kind of manipulation before. "So, you're telling me that Thomas attacked you, and you just happened to pick up the paperweight in self-defense?" Detective Reynolds asked. Leaning forward in her chair, Lila didn't flinch. "Yes," she replied coolly. "I never intended to kill him, but when he came at me, I had no choice. I had to defend myself." But the detective wasn't buying it. She knew that Lila's story had holes, and as the hours passed, it became clearer and clearer that Lila wasn't telling the whole truth. Weeks later, Lila's case went to trial. The prosecution's case was strong. The physical evidence, the damning testimony from the forensic experts, and the detailed investigation that had exposed her lies. Lila's defense, on the other hand, was weak. Her claims of self-defense had no credibility, and her cold demeanor in the courtroom did nothing to help her case. Lila was found guilty of second-degree murder, and she was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The jury had deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning their verdict. It was a quick and decisive decision. Lila had not been the victim of a tragic love affair. She had been a woman scorned, a woman driven to violence by her own obsession. Lila was led away in handcuffs. Her expression remained unchanged. She had lost everything. Her lover was dead, her future shattered, and her freedom taken away. But in the back of her mind, a small, twisted part of her felt relief. At least now, she would never have to face the truth of what had driven her to kill. In the end, Thomas Adams's murder was not just about love or betrayal. It was about obsession, power, and control. Lila had lost herself in her need for Thomas's love, and when he rejected her, when he threatened to destroy the world she had built in her mind, she had done the only thing she could to regain that control. She killed him, and now, as she sat in her prison cell, Lila realized that she would spend the rest of her life haunted by the man she had loved, the man she had murdered, and the choice she had made that could never be undone.